Hi, this is Tom Does Tech. I'm Tom, and welcome to the first video in the URL shortener series. In this video, we'll create the backend application or the API. So firstly, we'll set up the application, and then we'll add the route to create the short URL, and then we'll add some analytics, and then we'll containerize the application with Docker, ready to deploy. So let's get started by initializing the application with yarn init. And you can press enter on all those questions. And secondly, let's initialize the TypeScript with npx, TypeScript and the init flag. And this will create a tsconfig file. And you can see my setup here. I have a server folder, and in the next video, I'll create the UI folder here. And so this is what is called a mono repo with everything in one repository. So let's install the required dependencies. So we'll add express, cause, body parser, config. So we'll add express, cause, body parser, config, mongoose, yup, and nano ID. And we'll get into each of these as we progress through this video. Next, we'll add our dev dependencies, and we'll do that with the -d flag. So let's configure Nodemon so we can start our application and keep restarting it every time we make a change. So we'll create a nodemon.json file. And we can open that file and we can add this configuration here. And then we can come back to our package.json and we can add a scripts section where we can start the application. Now let's create our app.ts file so we can touch source app.ts. So we need to make our source directory. Then we can touch our source.app.ts. And if we open up our app.ts, we can console.log below, come down to our console, type yarn dev. And we can see that we have hello here. If we change this to hello world, we should see an update in the console. Great. So let's get started by creating our Express application. So import Express from Express, create const app equals Express, and we'll say app.listen on port 4000, and we'll give that a callback, and console.log application listening at use template string here, HTTP. So HTTP localhost port 4000, and we get that message console. So let's move this port to a configuration. So when we deploy the application, we can run this on any port that we would like to. So let's create a folder called config, and we'll create a file in that config folder called default. We'll open up our default config, and we'll export a default function from here. And we'll give it one property called port, and we'll set that to 4000. If we come back over to our application, we can import config from config, and we can get the port config and put that into a variable called port config.get port, and we can switch out these, and we should see the console have the same result. Great. So now let's create our routes. So we'll create a new folder called routes, and we'll create an index, and we'll create a function in here called routes, and we'll export that function as the default. And the routes function will take one argument, and that would be the app. That has a type of express, and we can import this express interface from express. We can also import the request and the response interfaces. And let's create our first route in here for a health check. So we'll say app get / health check. This will take a request response, and response.send app is healthy. So let's initialize our routes by importing them into our app.ts. And we'll initialize it after the server has been started, and it needs to take app argument. So if we open up a new terminal, we should be able to curl this endpoint / health check, and we see app is healthy. Okay, so now let's create our first model, and our first model will be the short URL model. So we'll create a file called shorturl.model.ts. I like to put model in the file name so I can see it up here in the tabs. So when we have a controller of the same name, I can differentiate those tabs. So you can see that I'm importing Mongoose and the document interface from Mongoose. I'm also importing the custom alphabet method from NanoID. I can use this custom alphabet method to create an instance of NanoID that takes all the letters of the alphabet and numbers 0 through 9. And we want these IDs to be 6 characters long. You can change these as well, these characters that are in here. So if you don't want numbers, you can remove that portion of the string. And if you want this short ID to be 10 characters long, you can change it. I'm creating a short URL interface here, which just has the short ID, will come from NanoID. And it has a destination, which will be the destination or the long URL. I'm creating my schema here, and you can see the short ID is defaulting to the result of NanoID. And we need these IDs to be unique, required, and their type is a string. And the destination is just a required string. And you can see here that I'm creating a constant, which is a Mongoose model, and I'm putting the short URL interface into the model's generic type. And we're calling this short URL, and we pass it the schema, and then we're exporting that model. So now let's create our controllers. And we can create a short URL.controller.ts. And we can create one function here, create short URL. And this function will take a request and a response. And again, we can import those interfaces from Express. So in this model, in this controller, we're going to get the destination from the request body. Then we're going to create a short URL. Then we're going to return the short URL. So let's say const equals request.body, and we're going to take this destination property out of the object. And we need to import short URL from short URL model, and then we'll say const short equals wait short URL.create, and we need to make this an function because we're using a wait. and we'll say the destination, we'll rename that. And then we're just going to return res.send new URL. So let's come back over to our routes and we can say app.post /API/URL. And then we can import our create short URL method. And that is going to be what gets called when we call this route. So let's go over to Postman and test this out. So I'm over here in Postman and I can see that I'm sending a post request to localhost 4000/API/URL and the destination is google.com. So let's send that and we're getting an error. So this error here is telling us that we can't read property destination of undefined. So if we come over here, it looks like it's trying to read the property destination of request.body. So this is telling us that body is undefined. We need to use bodyparser.json as middleware because in Postman, we're sending JSON. So if we come back over to Postman, we can send this request. We're trying to make a new instance of the URL shortener, but we can't because we don't have our database configured. So let's fix that with a new file called db.ts. And you can see that I'm exporting a default function here where we connect to our database. And in our configuration, it's going to look for a db URI. So let's come over to config and we can put that in. And when we come over to our app.ts, we can import db from db. And we can execute that function. And we'll connect to our database. So let's come back over to Postman and we can send this request again and you can see that we get back a short URL. So now that we have a short URL, we need to be able to hit that URL and redirect to the destination. So let's create a app.get and this will take one parameter called short ID and this will take a function called handle direct. And we can here, and we come over to our controller, we can export and handle redirect. So our request is going to have one parameter in it. So it will be rec.params. And I've typed this incorrectly, and so params will not be there. And this is going to have a short ID. So we can query our database for the destination. So we can say dest equals wait short URL dot find one short ID. And we can call .lean on that because we don't need any of the other methods that come with one. And we can say if not dest, we can return res.send status 404. Or we can return res.redirect for this short, say res.redirect short.dest. Let's come back over to Postman and copy this short ID. We'll make a GET request to localhost 4000 / this short ID, and we should see a redirect to Google. And it looks like we've got the 404. So let's have a look and see if we can see what is going on. And that needs to have a slash. Come back over to Postman, and we can see we get a 200. And it looks like this is the page for Google. So Postman has followed the redirect and sent us over to Google. So let's put a different URL on here. And we got a 404 not found, which is what we're expecting. So this API is almost complete, but there's one component missing. And that is that if we do not have destination on the request body, we're going to get some unexpected behavior. So we can say this, and we can see that we get an unhandled error. And so we want to add some validation to this endpoint. So let's make a new folder called middleware. And we'll create a file in the middleware folder called validate resource. Yes. And we'll input this function into our validate resource file. So this resource will take a schema of type any object schema, and it will validate that schema with our request body. And then if it does not validate the schema, it will return a 401. So let's make a new file in /schemas. So let's make a new folder called schemas. And we'll make a create short url.schema.ts. And we'll import some stuff from the object. And this will have a destination, which is a type of string. We can import from and we can say destination is required if there is no destination on the request body. So let's use this in our route. So we can import validate from middleware /validate resource. And we'll import URL schema from schemas/.url. And so we pass this middleware here like this. Then we just need to put our schema into the validate resource function. Wait for our server to restart. And if we come over to Postman again, send this off, we should see a 401. And unauthorized is not the correct HTTP verb there. So the correct HTTP error. So we'll change this to 400, and bad request looks better. The next step is to add some analytics. So we want to record every time somebody hits the short URL. So we'll create a new model for analytics. Yes. So our analytics model looks a lot like the short URL model, and we can get rid of nano ID here. We have a schema with a short URL, which is a reference to our short URL object. And we have some timestamps, and that is it. If we come to our short URL controller, we can import that model. And when we come down to send our redirect, we can say analytics.create. Say short URL is short.id. So if we come over to make our redirect, we get our redirect here. And if we create a new handler for fetching our analytics, and if we come over to our routes, we can make a new route called /API/analytics. And we can import our get analytics handler, put that in there, come over to Postman again, and we create a get analytics, get request. And we can see here that we have a few instances in the database of our short URL being hit. So the final thing we need to do is to containerize our application with Docker. So we can start by creating a Docker file, touch Docker file, and a Docker compose file with touch docker compose.yml. And in our Docker file, we'll put this configuration. So this is telling Docker to create a new image from Node 12 Alpine, which is a small version of Node. It moves the package.json into a temporary directory, installs all the dependencies, removes the old Node modules folder, runs the build script, and runs the application with PM2. So we need to add the build script. So add this build command, which runs tsc, which is TypeScript. And then in our tsconfig.json file, we need to put the output directory as /build. And we can test that by running yarn build. Finally, we need to update our DB URI to something that will work in our Docker container. So I've created a Mongo Cloud Atlas instance, and this is my connection string here. And so the last thing we need to do is set up the Docker compose file, which will run the Docker file. And then we can run docker compose up -d. -d will run it in detached mode, so it won't be tied to your console. Our Docker file has finished building, so we can come back over to Postman and try create a short URL. Looks like the application hasn't started up yet, so we can look inside Docker, our running containers, and see that the application is now running. So it looks like we have one problem here, and it says node m value of production did not match any deployment configuration file. And so for the reason for that is because in our config, we have our default config, but we need one for production. So we'll create copy default and call that production, and we will remove our DB string from here so we can use this when we're developing locally, and we can use this when we're in production. So if we come over to our Docker Hub, we can stop this container and we can delete it. And if we come over to our images, we can delete this image. And now we can run docker compose up -d again and build our image from scratch. So our Docker file has finished building again. And if we look in Docker Hub, we should be able to see the container running and the logs. And you can see that the application has started. So it looks like we've made one mistake with our validation. So in our validation, we're looking for a object of body, and we weren't sending the error along. We were just sending the status. So I've changed this to res.status 400, and we'll send the entire error object along. And then inside our schema, we need to define this as the body and then the destination object. So let's start our Docker container again with docker compose up -d, and we'll rebuild the application with the build flag. So our application has been rebuilt. So if we open up the Docker dashboard again, we can see that the application has been restarted. If we send a couple of requests, we should get a response. And we can see here that it has created one instance of short URL. And because we are now sending the full error object, we should see a good error message telling us that destination is required. Now, if we come over to Mongo Cloud Atlas, we should see the instance of our URL shortener inside the collection, and we do. So this has been part 1, where we created the backend. Join me in part 2, where we create the user interface. Thank you for watching.